Good morning, everybody. Thanks so much for joining our webinar today on local government finance. My name is Joe Fyans. I'm the head of research at Localis. We've got a really great panel assembled today to talk about the pressing issue of local government finance, how to get councils on a sustainable footing over the course of this parliament to start to do some of the many things that they're expected to do, from delivering public services to driving economic growth, placemaking, etc., and really looking at what financial structures, what kind of funding system is needed to allow local authorities to excel. We put out a paper on this subject at Localis last month called Biting the Bullet, which is the impetus for this webinar, where we looked at some of the key pressures that councils face and some of the kind of the spectrum of solutions, from the quite pragmatic to the quite radical, that could be used to try to restore council finances to a more sustainable footing in this parliament. And I'm going to invite, before we get into our panel discussion, I'm going to invite the author of that report, Sandy Forsyth, our lead researcher, to briefly go over what was in it and give us a quick overview of the issues. Sandy.
So we put together Biting the Bullet in sort of conversation with and response to the government's multiple stage spending review that they're in the process of rolling out. So this report is in the context of the well-rehearsed financial problems facing local government in England, instigated by years on years of spending cuts, and responding to the autumn budget and in preparation for what is still to come. So in the English devolution bill specifically, and the spending review next year. Those financial problems that councils are seeing are, of course, most compounded by that trifecta of temporary accommodation, particularly in the London boroughs, SEND education and social care, where councils are seeing demand outpacing funding and are further stymied by that ongoing workforce shortage and difficulties. So each crisis obviously requires strategic thinking and funding that thinks towards the long term. But it has become quite evident that any programme for future reform will require bold adjustments to the ways that local government is funded, whether that is to ensure a fair system of local taxation to engender better autonomy and more functional or efficient outcomes from local government spending. The report, Biting the Bullet, covers options for reform that are suggested as ways to restore financial credibility and sustainability to the local government sector, and suggests that given where the country are and where the government are politically, that some options for restructuring can and should be taken now, rather than sort of waiting in an unending stagnation going forward. It was good to see, and the report welcomes the budget as it came with additional funding through the finance settlement for next year and a real terms core spending power increase, alongside the assurance of the future multi-year settlement and recovery grant for areas with greater need and demands for services, and that being based on deprivation, given that the current system has been hindered by sort of outdated methodology there. But the report goes noting in particular the regressive state of council tax, possibilities for reform to business rates, and looking at a system based on turnover for business rates. The report approaches from the political argument and considering what relative winners and losers of a more progressive system would like and how the government might account for this. It also looks to the devolution of revenue-raising powers, exploring good practice and how to better raise small amounts of funding for targeted local expenditure. And finally, it also broadens the scope to look at a range of more radical transformations. So we think about land value tax or reform to national taxation. Understanding that while large shifts are unlikely to be approached in this parliament, but taking the view that there are learnings to be taken from international precedents and from considering the potential for greater local discretion and financial stability from these approaches. In the context of the government mission of stimulating growth, the long-term challenges facing local authorities need to be addressed in order to tackle regional disparities. And while the government has made signals indicating future reform in terms of devolution, local growth, and the simplification of funding structures, The question does need to be asked whether these shifts go far enough in ensuring that revenue matches spending and that local need is genuinely met, as underfunded services cannot just be bettered through changes to governance structures. So thinking about what can be done now and in the near future, and thinking to a more extended and sustainable long-term future. So thank you, and I hope the conversation can begin to touch upon these questions.
Thanks so much, Sandy. Appreciate that. So we're going to get into our panel discussion now. Have three great panelists here. Unfortunately, David Simmons MP cannot join us as advertised because he has parliamentary business to attend to this morning in committee meetings. So it's just the three of us today. I'm going to ask our panel to introduce themselves and give about 5 minutes on the topic to get us started, and then we will get into some Q&A. You can put your questions in the Q&A box. You can put them in the chat. You could, however you want to. You can email me, however you want to get them. We will read them and ask the panel. So I'm going to start with the Deputy Leader of Liverpool City Council, Ruth Bennett. Thanks, Ruth.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm Councillor Ruth Bennett. I'm Deputy Leader, Liverpool City Council, but also Cabinet Member for Finance, Resources and Transformation. So really just sort of setting out the things that we will want to see in the future. Those reforms that need to be prioritised would be about those. We've had the commitment to sort of multi-year settlements, simplified settlements, but I think really the priority needs to be put on the cap on placements across social care. We've had a sort of commitment, but there's still quite a lot behind there. I think recent sort of talk around it was only a cap on placements on those larger organisations, and there's still the sort of smaller ones below that. We would need, again, that commitment around the funding formula, recognising the needs and the services that we deliver. Short term, I think we would be looking around flexibility around fees and charges. Specific issues in the city where I'm a councillor is things around HMOs. So we would be looking, help and assistance around the flexibility, just say around HMOs, planning and so on. But at least where we can cover the cost of administration as well. I think I'll touch more around the fiscal devolution side of it, but would look hopefully maybe trials around fiscal devolution. We've got we've got trials around public sector reform, but if we could have something like that, that would be welcomed. And I think more generally, where we see sort of government having their protected budgets that recognise where local authorities, that funding for local authorities isn't protected, but recognise that some of our councils deliver social care elements, but recognise that's part of healthcare. SEND is part of education as well. So the plans sort of in the short term at the moment, there's a lot of uncertainty for us about what's coming forward, and it makes it difficult for us to plan. But the mood music is really good around fairer, longer term funding. But then there's got to be a recognition as well. What we're seeing this year is why, well, we're getting sort of additional funding. It's a lot of it is taken up by the increase in national insurance and the minimum wage as well. What would be longer term? What would we be looking in the future to support sort of longer term changes? I think that the discussion around funding for local authorities and the future of local authorities, it's got to be seen in the context of devolution and a discussion, I think, about what we mean by devolution. There's been a very much a fractured approach to devolution, and there's never been, so there's different devolution settlements in countries, in local authorities. We've never had that conversation about what the whole devolution picture looks like and where local authorities sit within that, nor do we have a conversation about what it is that we actually want local authorities to deliver, what's the purpose for it. We have a real disconnect, especially in cities like ours, where our residents see the role as local authorities being about bin collections, parks, etc. But what they don't see and don't understand is that, that social care element is 60 to 70% of our budget, that other side of it, that forward-facing role, is much smaller than what they think. So then we have to have that wider conversation about local authorities alongside a devolution discussion. What do we actually want the local authorities to deliver? What is the purpose as well? So we've got the debate certainly around that public sector reform, and Liverpool is going to be one of those authorities that is going to be trialling around the temporary accommodation, which is great, and in that longer term. But I think the timeline around that is up to 2028. What we want to see is that commitment to the short-term extra funding to protect us while we can do that public sector reform, because a lot of authorities like ourselves are really committed to being part of that, but we can't do that without that extra commitment on the shorter-term funding as well. Fiscal devolution, I think we would want to see it in the context of flexibility for local economies. Liverpool has a very different economy from other authorities. We can't rely just on council tax. I always use the same sort of quote, which is for every percentage we increase council tax by, we get around £2.5 million extra. Bristol would recover about £7 million extra. So we can never rely on council tax. It will never be a good system of funding for us. And you would just, the more you rely on that council tax, the more difficult it gets. And so we would want to be seeing sort of that flexibility around local economies. For Liverpool, we have a really strong cultural economy, and we would want to be able to harness that benefit for the local authority as well. At the moment, we can't. So again, I'd go on about the tourism tax as well. So I think where authorities just want a little bit as well around it, I think it relates to that role of local authorities as well. But where local authorities are struggling, that we've come out of a period of intervention from the government for various reasons. Other authorities are facing it for very different reasons. But it is not seen as a punishment, that it is more that government assists us and helps us to transform, to innovate. And I think our experience of that intervention initially wasn't great, but then as it progressed, we embarked on that innovation and that transformation. And you've got to see the benefit of it, and we've got to see that role as well for any government intervention that we get. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ruth. That was, I think, a really nice place to end it on, bringing in our next speaker from CITFA. Joanne Pitt is the Senior Policy Manager. I think, obviously, CITFA do a lot of work on innovation and transformation. So maybe Joanne want to cover off some of that. Joanne.
Yes, thanks, Joe. Yes, my name's Joanne Pitt. I'm the Senior Policy Manager here at CITFA. And for those of you not familiar with CITFA, the Chartered Institute of Public Finance and Accountants. So we are the global leaders in public sector financial management, but we also standard setters for a lot of the public sector. So as Joe said, we do a lot of work within the area of financial resilience and reform, with the importance of local government sort of very, very high on our list of priorities. We recently completed some work with an organisation called Demos, and I think that's probably a really interesting place for me to start with my conversation, my 5 minutes on local government reform, because I think that it's absolutely essential that we sort of start to step back and think strategically about reform. We can't really talk about financing without being really, really clear and understanding what we want our public sector to look like. There is not an endless supply of funding. That money, needs to add value. It needs to pay its way, and we need to maximise absolutely every penny of public sector funding. So we really need to sort of maybe step back, It's very, very easy, and we've done it for a number of years. We look into the detail with local government, but I think there's an important conversation to be had about public sector reform at a higher level, and where the thoughts about how we I know Ruth has touched on this, how we think that there should be the delivery of the public sector. What should the public sector be for? What are people's expectations for delivery? We've got a public sector that we all rely on, and it's a lifeline for many and most vulnerable, and we really need to maximise that and ensure that we are making it fit for the future. So there's conversations there around how we deliver that, and CIPFA is in conversation, moving hopefully to a more sort of liberated public sector. And by that I don't mean liberated as in no accountability, but a more liberated rather than target driven approach that allows people to think about place and people to think about outcomes. That is the way that public sector reform needs to go if we're going to be able to respond to the needs of our communities and to ensure that the money that we have delivers on those particular activities. Current government has the missions that are clearly identified. And so, we need to start to align with that, and conversations need to be had between central and local government about how we deliver on those, how we deliver on outcomes, and how we can look back in 5 years' time and see how some of those have been achieved. I was going sort of, I suppose, more short term than that, and because that is a long piece, changing sort of culture as well as mindset. Sort of thinking maybe about funding and about short term funding. Anybody who works in local government funding over the Christmas period always has a smile on their face, I think, because it's one of the busiest times of the year for those of us in local government. And we're accepting the provisional settlement. We had a very useful policy document out from central government about direction of travel. But I think it's really important that we are recognising the impetus that is being put into local government financial reform. I just sort of jotted a few things that are happening over the next couple of months. So we've got the provisional settlement, we've had the policy statement, we've got a business rates consultation on reset, which will be, it will play an important part in the funding decisions for many. We've also in the summer expecting funding reform consultation. So again, really big piece of sort of consultation and commitment that I would hope everybody on this call can get involved with. And then we've got the other piece of the jigsaw, which is absolutely essential, which is the Devo white paper, because we really need to think about form following function. So if we are starting to think about how we fund local government, we need to think about what local government looks like. And that's not just local government looking in the next sort of 2 to 3 years. That is 20 years' time. It's like, local government's a big tanker, and it takes a long while to change it into a slightly different direction. So it's really important that the decisions that we make on these consultations that are coming up in the next 6 months are ones where we think ahead for the reform. In the short term, I think that there is a lot of work, and CIPFA itself does a lot of work with local government about dealing with the here and now problems, about how you make the next budget. And there is a lot to be said for learning the lessons that are happening out there. What are other people doing that we can learn from? And so that's making the most of the money that you've got. And I think that that really is an important lesson. And at CITFA, the other thing that we've talked about when we think about reform is about making sure that we monitor and evaluate what's happened previously. And this one was on a panel with talking about place and about total place. And that's a really, when we talk about reform, that's a really good place to start to think about lessons for reform. But, you know, we've done that, we've moved on. And if we are starting to bring back that concept of place and place-based budgeting, what can we learn from those total place lessons? Because there was a lot of learning done sort of 10 years ago, and it's really important that we revisit that. We don't forget it. We don't repeat the mistakes of the past, but we learn the lessons. So I think that is really important. And I suppose the other thing, just before I pass over and we think about the reforms, is that it's really essential that when we think about funding reform or any form of reform, we think also about the capability and capacity of those that are going to do that reform. So anything that we are going to change about local government, and make no mistake, sort of changing and reform to funding is huge. It has an impact on organisations across the UK. There will always be some winners and some losers. If we start to change the way that we approach funding, or that funding comes in, we need to ensure that there is the capability and the capacity within those organisations to manage that change. And if there is an assumption that change will just be absorbed, that's a very dangerous place to be. So I think I would like to just finish my section on, if we are changing, and change and reform is absolutely essential, moving more towards place-based and outcome-based delivery, we need to make sure that the organisations we're expecting to handle that reform have the capacity to do it, the capability to do it, but also the confidence to do that. So that's probably my thought and introduction, Joe.
Thanks so much, Joanne. That was really helpful. I think we'll definitely get into this purpose of local government thing in a second. First, I would like to invite Mark Sanford, who is, if you've ever had to research anything local government, will need no introduction. He's from the Commons Library. I'll pass over to you now, Mark, to give your thoughts on local government finance.
Thanks, Joe, and thanks for inviting me. And I'm Mark Sanford. I'm a researcher at the House of Commons Library, published several things in this area. Just like to firstly congratulate Sandy on getting this report out. It's not easy to write a local government finance report in the current climate, because everybody's doing it, and trying to getting something original and useful is an achievement. So well done. I've also really agree with the points that fellow panelists have made. I'm actually going to take a different tack and get into the technical side of this. So apologies, but I think this is important stuff. And I'm going to, one of the sort of questions that Joe set us was what local government finance reforms should be prioritised by the government. And I'm going to have a go at that one. Preface it by saying I think that so far the government's approach is roughly the right one, addressing grant funding and trying to stabilise the system. And I think they're right to grapple with the fair funding review and the reset of business rates retention. All of that is more achievable in the short to medium term, before getting into things like council tax reform and fiscal devolution and so forth. But I just want to identify a few questions that I think the government will have to address in the direction that it's going, that are quite critical for outcomes for councils, but that I don't see picked up by the debates very much. So I'm first going to make a couple of points about how the grant funding, aspirations to merge grant funding. I'm secondly going to highlight a couple of technical options around the fair funding review, which the government has said it wants to get in place by April 2026. And I then want to quickly raise the question of shared taxes, which Sandy's report does get into towards the end. So looking at grant funding first, we know a reasonable amount about the government's intentions from the policy statement, the one that Joanne mentioned, that came out at the end of November. So they have said they want to merge a few small grants for next financial year, 25-26, and then the year after there's going to be a big bang, basically. There's going to be a new needs assessment implemented coming out of the Fair Funding Review. They're going to reset the business rates retention system. And those two things, basically two sides of the same coin, because if you're going to implement the Fair Funding Review, business rates retention reset is most of how you do it. But on top of that, there's also going to be a business rates revaluation taking effect in 2026. And all of this will have substantial effects on the amounts that local authorities receive in grant funding and business rates. So as Joanne Pitt was saying, if there are going to be big changes, making sure that they land well is going to be very important. I think there's a couple of points that's worth making around these commitments. First of all, we know the Fair Funding Review is going to be based on assessing needs, probably in a number of different sort of service blocks, needs for adult children's social care, transport, public health, and so forth. And actually, the previous Fair Funding Review, which ran into the sand in 2018, made quite a bit of progress in this area. But one thing it didn't get anywhere with was how much money will be distributed in each of those blocks, the weighting between them. So how much money do you distribute according to adult social care need? How much money do you distribute according to transport need, and so on? And that's a distinct issue from how the formula works, but it will have an absolutely fundamental effect on outcomes for councils. So that's definitely something to watch. Secondly, that policy statement from November said for 2026-27, we will radically simplify the local government funding landscape, consolidating grants from across central government. Well, that caught my eye. That's a substantial commitment. And what I would really like to know is, does that apply to all the sort of small short-term bid-based grants, which are the bane of everyone's life and get a lot of bad press? Or does it apply to the sort of wider ecosystem of the big recurrent grants? Councils might, for instance, have their eyes on things like public health grant, or even whisper it, the dedicated schools grant. If that's where this is going, that's going to need a lot of Whitehall buy-in, and I am always told that's not easy to achieve. So again, watch this space. Secondly, I want to do say a couple of things about the Fair Funding Review. 2 points that didn't appear in the previous consultations. First of all, and bear with me on this one, when the Fair Funding Review is doing a needs assessment, it should use the approach that was used between 2003 and 2007, not the one that was latterly used between 2007 and 2013. Why am I going on about this? Well, the latter approach was really untransparent and often produced perverse results. And I'm not going to try and explain how that worked because it's very complex, but just to flag up, that has, again, far-reaching effects on the outcomes for individual councils. And it's really important for transparency because the most recent system, you just couldn't tell why an individual council got the amounts it got. So that's a really important matter to take into account. Second, the Fair Funding Review should use as few indicators to determine needs as it possibly can. This is good for simplicity and good for transparency. The previous systems used upwards of 100 indicators, but it's actually possible to use far fewer than that, but to end up at almost exactly the same place. For details on both of these points, I strongly recommend looking up a report called Reforming Local Authority Needs Assessment, which was produced in 2017 for the Housing, Communities and Local Government Committee in the Commons by a consultancy called LG Futures, and that explores both these issues at length, and it's a really good report. If you want a link, email me. And the third matter I wanted to provide some observations on is the whole fiscal devolution question. Now, I think the important point here is that there are a lot of options for fiscal devolution. It will take time to explore them, construct a system that can be delivered and that works. That applies to both what central government wants to do and what different parts of local government want to do. And it's particularly tricky because England is a very economically unequal country. Different localities raise very different amounts of tax revenue per head, and that applies to almost any tax you choose. And that's partly a story of London and the South East versus the rest, but there's a few more nuances to it than that. Now, I think the task in this Parliament should really be to explore the options in detail, identify whether there are any taxes that could be realistically be devolved, and how that would work. And one option I think worth exploring is the idea of shared taxes, which is used in numerous other countries where local government, and often regional government as well, has access to a set percentage of certain national taxes. Now, in many different ways this can be done. A share of a tax can be allocated to the area in which it was raised, or a share of a tax could be allocated to the whole sector and distributed according to a formula. Now, and there are many different options in between those two. And I think in introducing a system that looks anything like this, there would be have to be some clear thinking about what we're trying to achieve. And that goes back to the question other panelists raised, what we want the public sector to look like. And I just want to flag up here, looking at other countries' experiences, I would say the purpose elsewhere of things like shared taxes is not so much about finding a way of getting more money or putting tax rates up. It's much more about local authorities being able to forecast their revenues with greater confidence over a number of years and having access to a broader range of resources, which gives greater resilience. And it's actually interesting to see that countries, Japan is a good example, which have moved in recent years towards a more sort of devolved and shared tax-based system, have done that explicitly because they wanted a system that would prevent councils falling into financial trouble, because they had their problems with that back in the 90s. And the aim is not to encourage councils to raise taxes. And indeed, local taxes which are devolved in this way often aren't really raised that much. The revenues are sort of much the same from area to area, perhaps a percentage point up or a percentage point down. It's not the Wild West. So these are important points to bear in mind when designing a system. Just to plug, I have a jointly authored book coming out with a number of colleagues on this subject shortly. But that's all I wanted to say. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mark. I'm going to come back on that book point and on the impact examples in a second. I want to get into discussion now. Do please, everybody, put your questions in the Q&A or the chat. Otherwise, I will just talk about local government reorganisation. I'll do it. So until then, can we talk a little bit about that purpose of local government point? Because I think everybody mentioned in some form or other what local government should do. And Ruth, if I could start with yourself as an elected official, I think it's an important thing to ask, what do the public want local government to do, and where does the disparity? I mean, you talked about quite rightly disparity between what people expect of local government, what they get out of it, and I guess just from your perspective as someone who obviously spends time on doorsteps, what do the public want council to do, and where are they failing to do that?
I think it goes back to the lack of conversation, and there's a lack of understanding. I think in Liverpool, our experience of devolution, we had sort of a city mayor. At one point, we had a city mayor, a regional mayor, a Lord Mayor. We've had various sort of devolution points as part of that. And I think there's a lack of understanding from residents. At the moment, we have like the regional side of it. They don't know that element of it. So you will get different communities have different communities just in the city will have a different expectation of local authorities. So some who are very close to the SEND provision will have frustration with the lack of provision in the local area, which has knock-on effect for finances. You will have some communities that really it's just about getting the bins collected, getting the streets swept, and they have a limited knowledge of anything else. For others, it will be around community organisations and so on, or getting potholes filled and that. I mean, so one of our experience just over highways is there's an aspect that is devolved to the regional, so Liverpool City region. So where's the conversation about what, we have sort of clear, routes, we've got bus deregulation. We could join that up because at the moment it comes from the region to the city authorities, but there's no conversation there. Should the regional side of it be taken over the main highways to link in with sort of that public transport strategy? Should we just be dealing with sort of smaller roads? It's those sort of things. It's those. There are different expectations in different communities in the city. So even any discussion around local authorities has to have that, even that sort of lower local level as well, about what that expectation is.
You're on mute, Joe.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, just to thanks for to take that question more sort of England level from Joanne, obviously getting a SIPA perspective, and having carried out the work you did with demo stuff. I guess it's a background of how is local government currently set up to deliver? What and where is the kind of, when we talk about the public sector needing reshaping, where are the kind of flaws there from your perspective at SIPA in how it's funded for what it's supposed to deliver?
Right. I think that this goes back as well to the way policy dictates with outcomes as well, because if you think about some of the funding streams, they're very specifically targeted. So even as they come out of different departments, so different departments have very specific policy objectives that they want. They see local government as a policy arm to deliver that specific policy objective, and then there's a funding stream that sits behind that. I think that everyone on this call will be familiar with SIPFAs and others call to sort of reduce the amount of small funding pots, and I think that goes some way to sort of remove some of the barriers. But the idea of there's a policy from central government to deliver something very specific that comes from a pot. There are sort of targets surrounding that, or there are controls around that very specifically, and they can create and stifle sort of innovation and flexibility around that. It has to be delivered in a certain time frame. It has to be delivered in a certain manner. It has to, and sometimes that becomes quite difficult, particularly when you think about, which is what I was talking earlier about, it should become more outcomes based, because that then drives outputs. So the way the funding is allocated in certain ways can drive specific behaviours. In fact, it can, in the worst case scenario, drive perverse incentives. So what we want to do is to ensure that the policy decisions are creating the best outcomes, and they are then supported by the funding streams that support those outcomes. Small allocated pots have proven not to be helpful, and there has been a move over the last couple of years away from that, which I think is certainly a move in the right direction. But there needs to be a move. Mark picked this up. There also needs to be a move from central government to ensure that there is a move away from a silo mentality of budgeting towards much more of an outcome-based approach, which allows local authorities the flexibility to deliver on outcomes-based objectives rather than specific targeting.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Dan. I think so. From Mark, I'm going to try and roll my question for you on this theme in with a comment from Tiago Ventura in the Q&A, which is about the connection of local people to kind of outcomes in local government. And it comes down to when, I know your book looks at different models and different systems. I suppose I wonder how well, when you look at Japan, when you look at Germany, how well aligned are things like fiscal devolution with the kind of role of local government within that system? And sort of to pick up on Tiago's question a little bit, does that seem to drive, or from what you've seen, better engagement with local government, the presence of these fiscal levers and a more autonomous local sector?
Yeah, I mean, taking the second one last, we didn't particularly look at the impact on engagement in the research we did. I would say, as generally, I am sceptical that more tax powers for localities translates directly into more local engagement. I'm not going to deny there's an effect, obviously, but I don't think it necessarily drives up local turnout. There's a relationship there, but I wouldn't use it as a sort of a crux of democratic renewal. And it very much depends, as I was saying, on how you do it. I think, just to take an example, if you devolved a few pence in the pound of income tax in the same way as council tax, that would raise a lot more money in some areas than others. And that itself would mean that kind of system was very difficult to make stick and to achieve legitimacy, because people would say, well, this is not fair on certain areas. How are we supposed to improve services, run services, when we're raising so much less money? So fiscal devolution and a very unequal polity like England are not easy bedfellows. Joe, I'm very sorry, I've forgotten the first question you asked me because I've been on for so long. No
worries. So just the point of do you find when you look at Japan or Germany that the role of local government and its purpose is better defined than it is in this country?
Yes, it is, because there are explicit definitions in some cases in the Constitution, in some cases in kind of enabling legislation, and those have been linked through sort of big formal reform processes to the kind of the funding that is received. And I should say that although those two countries do use shared taxes, there is also a quite extensive redistribution system in place. So it's not the funding that local areas receive does have a reasonable link to the tasks they're expected to carry out and to the difficulties they face in carrying out those tasks.
Thanks, Mark. I want to get into Andy Pike has asked in the chat a few interesting questions on this thing of geography to discontent, which I guess really makes the point that local authorities are not kind of mindless entities. There are different kind of pressures and inequalities within local authorities. And how can local authorities address that? Is it about more accessible and better services, more local participation, and say greater role for other and more local relations? I'll invite the panel to pick up on any one of those issues, and I guess just keeping it in order. If Ruth, do you have any comments on that issue of geographies of local discontent and what councils can do to address them?
So that's sort of a real discussion that we're talking about at the moment, and it's about how we deliver services close to the ground. So if we're sort of bringing in what we talk about as a neighbourhood model, and as part of that, we're sort of we're testing our services around our customer service, testing sort of where we deliver, how we deliver those services. But as part of that, what we're doing as well is really doing that low-level engagement with people. When we've done engagement with people, it's been very much almost like not a passive. We do sort of, when you do consultations, that's fine. But the work that the council does has been very much, we publicise that and we expect people to engage with it. Now we're doing it much more closer to those communities. In my own ward, sort of public meetings, talking about the priorities of those communities and where we can focus our resources around that. So it's a conversation that's sort of ongoing, but in the council where the sort of the focus for us is actually taking it to those communities and having those conversations with the communities.
Brilliant. Thanks, Ruth. Did you have any thoughts on that, on that sort of series of questions, Joanne?
I think when you're talking about engagement, it's really essential. Then you sort of, your line for engagement is, the councillors and the elected members. It's absolutely crucial that they are aware of the transparency around funding, and funding for members is really often quite a difficult area to grasp. And I have the greatest admiration for them when they take it on. So I think from our point of view, we would really sort of promote the support around sort of scrutiny and the governance to make it great, to make it transparent. So to make sure that funding is very transparent, and so that members are able to have those conversations. They know and are clear with the decision making around the financials and why decisions have been made, and are also confident enough to ask questions of officers when they are unclear. And I think that sort of transparency then filters through, not just by the way that they are able to communicate, but through to the communities that they communicate to when they speak to them, whether that is at specific meetings or on a day-to-day basis in their sort of social media.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Joanne. Mark, do you have any thoughts on Andy's questions?
Not quite my area, I think. Sorry.
In which case, I have another one which very much is talking to this point about equalisation. There's a few questions on the issue of equalisation, and I guess one of the things that's fascinating to me when you look at other systems is it seems like so politically intractable to try and do anything like that in this country, because, which as John put in her opening comments, there will always be winners and losers. We do a bit of modelling in the report where Sandy looks at the effect that different council tax revaluations would have, and it would be dramatic. And I guess how do you have a sense of how political is it in a country like Germany when we look at local taxation at national level, and how political is it to try to change or adjust that both locally and nationally?
It is political, and it's not easily done. And Germany has recently introduced what amounts to a business rates revaluation. That came in 2020, and it's being introduced over 5 years. It's replacing rateable values from 1964. That tells you that other countries don't find this kind of stuff any easier than we do. I think there's 2 points that spring to mind. One is that getting this stuff right just seems to be a bit more of a cultural priority in these countries, and partly that relates back to constitutional context, which in Germany in particular, but also in Japan and Italy, sees local and regional authorities as equal in importance to national government and forming part of the political, the sort of national political system in a way that we're not really familiar with here. I think the second point to make is that because other countries have a large number of different sources of revenue, the impact of each one of them on overall budgets is more muted. We're accustomed to a system where we've got grants and we've got council tax, 2 things. So if anybody starts messing around with one of them, it has a massive effect on the overall outcomes for a lot of councils. Whereas in Germany, the property tax, going back to that, it raises roughly, and this is between domestic property and business property, it raises roughly 15 billion euros a year. Compare that with 55 million pounds from council tax and business rates. So the impact is just not the same. So they're entirely different systems, not easy to change, quite difficult to get there.
Thanks very much. Good to hear. I guess just to get to our final sort of round, Luke Masters has raised the spectre of local government reorganisation in the Q&A, and I think without sort of trying to get too much into the white paper and trying to read the tea leaves of what exactly will be in it, I think it's worth sort of considering to what extent we think that organisation and structure is the problem here, I guess. So to kind of slightly skew your question a bit there, Luke asked about districts and their ability to deliver. And I think the broader question is, to what extent will any kind of reorganisation, can any kind of reorganisation solve the delivery problems that we have? And I guess, Joanne, given your purview, it might be best to throw that one to you if that's not too dicey.
Right. So I think when you're talking about local government reorganisation, I think it's really important that we understand that not one size fits all. So I think that that's a really important premise to start with, and that that we can look to see what lessons can be learned. If you think about the studies that have happened, and the type of size of organisation that is necessary, I think that Mark makes a very good point about you have to be big enough in order to be more resilient, because you can then, as an organisation, you can survive, the ups and downs better, because you have a greater ability to do that. Sort of when you're, the smaller as an organisation you are, and where you're very focused, you probably have less ability to do that. So I think that there is something to be said in that, and also the pressures of the organisations are facing are not the same across the board. So if you have a look at the organisations, so SIPA has done a lot of work with those that are specifically facing significant financial challenges. A lot of them can be traced back. Maybe they're on the coast, south coast. There's a homelessness problem. There's a specific size of unitary, perhaps, where they are facing a specific send problem. So those sorts of organisations, no matter how well they are run, are going to struggle financially if the funding system stays the same and they stay the same. So right. I think that there is perhaps an inevitability that that reform and reorganisation needs to happen. But I would go back to one of the first points I made initially, is that we do really need to learn some lessons from what's happened before. So don't make those mistakes again. What's happened, take the work sort of Mark's doing, internationally, and translate that across the board, and give people the capability and capacity to make that change, which I think will certainly be needed in the future.
And Ruth, obviously, big part of the Metropolitan Borough within a combined authority region. I guess from that kind of internal perspective, how much potential do you think that model has to kind of overcome, to lead to innovations, to overcome problems of delivery? The combined authority, that borough type model.
I think it's an issue sort of Joanne touched on before. It's around capacity and strengthening the authorities within that, which for Liverpool, that's one of the things that we've been doing over the last few years. It's the closer working with the city region that we are really improving as well. That's helped a lot for that integration as well. So it's really that dialogue, the structures within the authority and the region as well, but a clear sort of demarcation of what those powers are really for us.
Brilliant, thanks. And I guess finally then, just to finish this off, Mark, on local government reorganisation, the topic that I'm sure you left out of bed this morning, excited to talk about. What if we had a country of combined authorities at a sub-regional level, do you think that we would have more manageable units for things like fiscal devolution than we currently have under a kind of mishmash system?
Most likely, yes, would be my answer. Because there was a pretty good report which covered this point by the Independent Commission on Local Government Finance 9 years ago, which did some modelling, which showed that there's if you have 40 units, there's less interregional variation than if you have 400 or something like that. So the answer is probably yes, but I wouldn't want to play down the difficulties that you'd have, because the figures that Ruth gave earlier show the starkness of the divide in tax take between different areas. That there's no easy solution to that, which doesn't involve redistributional grants.
Brilliant. Thanks so much. Well, I'm going to, rather than try to squeeze another question in 5 minutes, I'm going to call proceedings to a close there, and just say thanks so much to our panel, Ruth, Mark and Joanne, for the excellent contributions today. Thanks so much everyone for coming and for putting your questions in the Q&A and the chat. Hope we got through them as best we could. Thank you so much, everybody, and class.